Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another installment of the Prosperity Through Multifamily Real Estate Investing Podcast. I am your host, Real Estate Cody, and I'm flying solo today. The coffee connoisseur, Mr. Brian Alfaro, is unavailable this morning. So when you tune in to this episode, make sure to reach out to him and give him a hard time for missing. We don't want to let him get off the hook that easy, but I am excited to be here, though, with a longtime friend of mine, and excited. We've kind of rescheduled this podcast a couple of occasions over the last several weeks to get here today. But today I'm speaking with a good friend of mine, Mr. Jeff Davis. Jeff is a global logistics sales executive for a Fortune 100 company based here in Houston, Texas. He's a global supply chain and logistics professional since 2005. Jeff began investing in real estate in 2015 as a single-family landlord, and in 2021 divested all of his single-family assets and moved entirely into multifamily, which, Jeff, I know is the way of the world today, which we absolutely believe in. But hey, man, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, man. It is a journey, and it's a fun one. It's good to be here.
It sure is, buddy. It sure is. Like I said, I know we tried connecting roughly, man, I think about 6 weeks ago, six to 8 weeks ago or so to get you on the podcast. And then we've had some scheduling conflicts, but better late than never, as we always like to say. And I think with your background, which we're going to dive into here, I think we're going to have some really good conversation about, what we're seeing in the marketplace today as far as impacts on inflation and macroeconomics on a global scale. And why that's important to us as real estate investors. But before we kind of get into the nitty gritty here, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you found your way into commercial real estate?
Yeah, so I'll go all the way back to where I grew up and how I got into Houston, right? So I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, in a suburb of Metairie, Louisiana. So I am what we call a Catrician. I blew in with the storm, and we are so after the storm, got here and just started knocking on doors to find somebody who would give me a job, and that's how I got into logistics. I started as a data entry clerk, and I just grabbed on to that business and worked my way up from data entry into a sales position. I really enjoyed solving problems for clients and being in front of those customers, learning about what the challenges were and solving it, and been in the sales role ever since 2008, right as the recession hit, and solving those challenges, right? And it's been a good career. It's provided well for my family and I. And so that's what I've been doing since 2005 to this day. Real estate came, like I said, around 2015. I knew I wanted to be a landlord. I knew I liked that avenue. So we actually saved up enough money to maintain our homestead and purchase the house that we actually live in now, and began renting it out. From there, purchased another rental, and I just started diving into more and more about the single family. How can I grow this portfolio? Learning about wholesaling, flipping houses, and it just became so much work, right? My family's growing. I'm always out at these properties. I'm working with sellers who seem to be always working with other wholesalers, dealing with contractors. It was a constant struggle. And Cody, I was talking with you and John last year as I was flipping several properties at the same time. I even hired people on kind of my staff to try and scale up. It's very difficult to scale in the single family space. So that's inevitably where I ended up selling the entire portfolio and moving it to a much more scalable business in the multifamily space.
Yeah, love the trajectory there, Jeff. And I know we've talked about this over the years, and I think you're very humble. You downplay it a lot, but you had a very successful run in the residential space. I mean, you had a pretty substantial, fix and flip or wholesale business there for a while. And I know we got connected. What's funny is we joke with everybody, right? Like we owe all of our success of Blue Oak to Jeff Davis, because Jeff, you made the initial introduction between John and I, which formulated a partnership, and then here we are today. But John, being the very astute investor that he is very, very particular, and about who he trusts and who he really works with. And I think he was an investor with you in some of those projects, right? And that says a lot about the business that you had developed, and the processes that you had put in place. So I think that's just important to highlight, man. You had a really good run there in residential.
Yeah, he was. And that's why I was leaning on him, right? Is I am grinding every day, and I'm watching him and you and Brian. And so by the end of 2021, I had seen Blue Oak scale. And after every transaction that I would do, I'm still starting at the bottom. I talked to you and John of how do I scale? And so it's been a great resource to have with you and the Blue Oak team.
Oh, hey man, we appreciate
And
that.
John is a great resource, man. So it's all you guys, right? It's been great.
Man, we appreciate that. And I mean, look, that's what it's about, right? Giving back value, and just helping to add any insights that we can and help people get started. And I was so excited last year when you called me and you're like, hey, I'm ready to make this pivot. What do I got to do? And I was like, yeah, it's like, yes, finally. So I was excited.
Mindset shift.
And that's what it's about, man. That's the biggest thing, right? It's all mindset. And we talk about that. We won't go into that tangent. I know I could talk about it forever now, but it's just getting out of your own way and removing your own limitations, and realizing that, hey, the same amount of time and effort you're putting into residential, you could be putting into commercial, and translate that same success. So
absolutely.
But like I said, we'll save that tangent and rant for another day. The listeners have heard me talk about that time and time again. So, hey, so I want to kind of pivot then, and I really want to dive into your corporate background on supply chain logistics and such, because I think it's such a relevant topic for today, and I hope the listeners please tune into this conversation, because what we are seeing now as far as this inflationary environment is a supply chain disruption, right? And the Fed monetary policy is utilizing a demand lever to curb the supply side pressure, right? And so they're using interest rates to fix an issue that can't be solved with just raising interest rates, right? We needed to see a resolve in the supply chain issue. And I know for me, what was a big shock coming out of the pandemic was just how fragile the global supply chain really is, and how that impacted our economics and such. So what I'd like to do is really kind of start off by laying out the framework with your expertise and background on kind of how the global supply chain is all interconnected, and how does it impact our daily lives as American citizens in ways that we probably don't even realize.
Yeah. So I would go back to 2008, 2009, right? And what happened then? Financial collapse. And when you have all of these ocean carriers that carry the large bulk of our goods from Asia and Europe to the US, and from the US to Asia and Europe, they saw a tremendous demand drop. And so now they're at a huge financial loss. Their ships are moving at a large deficit, and they were essentially empty. And they weren't empty, but they're moving at a large financial deficit. The difference now is, what does everybody have? They're all at home, and they have Amazon, right? They've got the power to purchase goods at their home. And this was just a different dynamic, where demand actually spiked for consumer goods, both in Europe and in the US, and the manufacturing was still going on overseas. So it was kind of an inverse problem, or an inverse situation from a previous financial bellwether, if you will. And that highlights your kind of goes into your fragility of that supply chain issue, where the demand for the same capacity spiked and the capacity did not adjust. And all of the port workers, everybody was at home. So you had a reduction in staffing and labor, causing severe congestion at those port locations, both on the West Coast, East Coast, and Gulf Coast. So from there, the demand increasing caused pricing fluctuations to skyrocket over the next 12 months. And I can go on from there unless you had another question.
Yeah, no, let's kind of try to dissect that a little bit, because I think to your point, you're absolutely right. I mean, people were forced to be at home. They were forced to, really live their life within their home. And like you said, what else could you do except for shop online or do whatnot? But what's interesting is, right, all these other industrial countries were also, as a global scale, at a global outlook, we were all experiencing the same pandemic, right? Every industrialized country was really taking the same approach, where everybody was quarantining. All manufacturers, employers were really shutting doors and putting the pause button because of the unknown, risk. And so I'd imagine that, that also played into that, supply deficit as well, because if I recall correctly, the data suggested that actually supply and development actually maybe had fallen off, while we were still seeing that spike in demand. Am I assuming that correctly?
Supply of goods or transportation? Oh, yes.
Yeah.
You've got these factories overseas, and they had to shut down as well. In fact, India had a very hard lockdown, and parts of China had a very hard lockdown. Those are different countries than the U.S., where it's not quite as liberal, if you will, or democratic, where those countries, they say if you're going to lock down, you're locking down. And those factories were locked down. So in that regard, yes, you had a supply shortage as well. Couple in with that, there's several other black swan events. We had a major freeze here in Houston. It was an inconvenience for you and me at home. Well, we actually supply quite a bit of raw material overseas, right? Our Gulf Coast is a refinery, the Gulf Coast. We supply petrochemicals all over the world. We actually supply the petrochemicals to China that makes some finished goods that come over here. It's petrochemicals as well for finished goods that come over here. Well, now they had a shortage as well for raw materials that come from the US. So you add that into an already shortened supply situation. That's during COVID, right? That's during an already strained supply chain. We had 2 evergreen vessels get stuck for weeks on end. For weeks. That's with millions of, or not millions, but several thousand containers that just sat, unable to get out. That affects everybody.
I remember seeing that headline in the news and seeing this massive ship in this canal, this waterway that was stuck and isolated there for, like you said, weeks. And I'm like, and the whole world just seemed like it was shutting down because of that entire waterway was a really it was a gateway to trade and global supply delivery and things like that. And I'm like, how in the world are we so dependent on just one access, one water supply or waterway that is the essentially lifeline of our global supply trade? And it was flabbergasted by it, and it just, again, it really highlighted and exacerbated just how fragile our infrastructure is when it comes to global trade and things like that. And you made a really good point too, as as we were navigating these pandemics, the economic policies and the government legislative policies of these other industrialized countries and their differences versus how, what we were implementing at a certain point. You mentioned China, for example. China had a very strict zero COVID policy, right? And so we saw that here recently over the last several months, where China actually went back into lockdown,
That's
because
correct.
they had more
You're right.
COVID cases. And the fear was, I think a couple months ago when we were supposed to actually record this, we started to see maybe potentially, some softening in that supply chain interruption. Like maybe we were going to start seeing things kind of resolving. And then China goes back into lockdown and everybody's fear is heightened again, because they're like, oh man, we're so dependent on China as a import for us. So I don't know, I'm assuming they're back open and hopefully,
Yeah,
yeah.
they are. And when I think our original time to record this was in May. And so you had an absolute correct, right? They were locked down. And at the time, prices, and just to give some context here, a good measure for where prices and flow of goods is called the Shanghai Container Freight Index. Anybody can go and Google that and see what the trajectory is, where we're at right now. And historically, and of course, I'm in Houston. We're in Houston. I measure everything from Shanghai to Houston. Typically, my entire career, it's been $3,000 to $4,000. An importer can get goods here to Houston, around that number, right? It's a range. In the peak, they've been paying between $20,000 and $25,000. That's a significant increase on a business. If you're bringing in 100 containers a year and you're used to paying $300,000 to $500,000 a year in transportation, and now it's in the millions, that's a huge increase, and that's going to be passed to you and me, the consumer. Hence inflation. Now it's trending back. Since we originally scheduled, it has been trending back downwards, and that was what's interesting is that demand is really kind of coming down.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I want to kind of tie this all in, right? Is you saw this massive, implication and disruption in the supply chain. You saw this spike in demand that, like you said, well exceeded the supply delivery. And there was just no way that we could even catch up to that, right? We just saw a rapid spike very quickly. And so, like you said, we saw massive price inflation that's translating down to the consumer. And I think we were initially able to absorb that because people had savings that they were accumulating. They had fiscal policy that was supporting them. But so spending habits didn't change, even with price inflation. But then what happens is people started tapping out their reserves, and then now it's a problem, right? So, but really, I really want to focus more on the Fed impact of this, right? Is because, like we mentioned, this inflationary period that we're seeing, and the inflation data that is in place now is a result of the circumstances 12 months ago, right? And so it takes that long to trickle through the system. And the Fed's only way to really curb that is by putting pressure on the demand side to say, hey, we've got to slow down the demand. And how do you do that? You got to increase the cost of capital, right? But knowingly, it's not going to fix the underlying issue, which is the supply chain disruption.
You just hit the nail on the head, right? So all of these costs, and obviously transportation is one factor of those costs, and then you've got the increased labor even overseas. You've got longer lead times. You've got increased material costs overseas. That's a 9 to 12 to 15 month lag. So if those increased costs are all the way through, I'm looking at my calendar, all the way through May, that's a 12-month lag that some retailers and manufacturers here and distributors, that they're going to have through their distribution channels for, all the way through until they get rid of that product, till they sell that product. So now the Fed is making monetary policy, and there's a lag on that as well. So my humble, Houston sales guy opinion is, the slowdown of demand is because these consumers, everybody's feeling the effects of all these increased costs for what happened last year. Like this is the effect. This is the increased cost of this rampant buying frenzy over the past, from 12 months ago, and consumer stores, retail stores, they're just reactive. Like, oh man, my shelves are empty. I got to capitalize on this. I have to pay 10x, but this is what the stores want.
And that's another great point too, is these store retailers, manufacturer distribution centers, they were living so long on scarcity that when supply chain actually started to pick up and start delivering those goods again, what we've seen, or at least my interpretation again of the data, was they started accumulating as much of those goods as they could and keeping a surplus in their reserves to try to meet that demand. And now that demand pressure is coming down because of the, like you said, the cost implications and the Fed policy, consumer demand is now starting to pull back a little bit. Now retailers are stuck with all of this excess supply that now they can't offload, right? And so it's kind of interesting to see that massive shift in such a short period of time.
Yeah. Well, it's expensive supply,
yeah.
And you couple that with higher gas,
which is very painful right now. Yeah. And one thing that people don't know about you, Jeff, you got a big family, so you're driving a big old vehicle.
I drive two big vehicles. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I know it.
I got part of that big family is two teenagers, and they're like locusts.
Good stuff, man. Yeah. So look, I really appreciate the dialogue here and really the this conversation, because again, I think understanding this dynamic at play here will really put this into context. Because if you ask me, in my opinion, I don't think the Fed really wanted to raise rates at the beginning of the year. We have never seen the Fed's position change so dramatically. If everybody recalls back to November of last year, the Fed was still maintaining their position on no rate hikes for 2023. And, they were going to stay the course. But I think the political pressure that was being inflicted by the general public and the media outlets and whatnot was screaming, hey, you have to do something. And so I think their hand was sort of forced to enact, but I think they knew exactly what we're discussing today is like, look, this is a supply chain issue that can't be fixed with monetary policy to a vast degree, right? And so, and now what we're seeing, to your point, is that you have Fed monetary policy that's being enacted today that also has lagging effects for the next 12 months. So we're not going to see the impacts of these rising interest rates on a macroeconomic scale until really next year. But what we've seen is the supply chain is resolving. We are starting to see, again, some of that interruption being resolved, and now things are kind of picking back up and normalizing. And again, I think if the Fed had it their way without any outside influence going into that, knowing that, they wouldn't have been raising rates nearly as aggressively, if anything, as they are now. So it's going to be interesting to see, what happens 12 to 18 months from now.
But like you said, right, it's political pressure and it's reactionary, and that what effect it is having is a little bit different, and they are being ultra aggressive on the inflation. So you couple that with the global supply chain and what effect it has on inflation. Hopefully it is positive, because if the recent history is any indicator, 12 months from now, consumer prices should be down or could be.
Yeah, let's only hope. I know, it's taking a major impact no matter what your economical status is, or your income status, net worth is, whatever. I mean, everybody's feeling the pain from this inflationary period,
It is pain.
It is pain. And the ones that are getting the most impacted are those who are dependent on fixed incomes, or those who are earning less than, a certain amount a year, call it 50, 60,000 a year. Though that demographic is being impacted the most by this impact. And so, it's going to be painful for a while. So to that point though, I want to use that as a segue into how does that affect us as real estate investors, right?
Yep.
And because the cost of capital has risen because of the rising interest rates, and so that has made it a very big barrier to go secure the right financing to acquire our properties, right? 3 months ago, 4 months ago, I mean, it was relatively a painless process to get decent debt, 75, 80% leverage, and you can go in and pretty much execute on that without any major headwinds. Now it's the complete opposite. Now it is extremely difficult to navigate the capital markets, whether you're doing, non-recourse agency debt, bank debt, if you're looking at bridge funds or bridge lending, debt funds, all these things like that. And so the debt market, the capital markets right now are extremely, extremely challenging right now. It's the biggest headwinds that we're facing. And it's causing a lot of people to put pencils down, right? I mean, a lot of our competitors are saying, hey, you know what, we got to let this dust settle before we feel comfortable picking our pencils up. But I want to get your take, Jeff. I mean, what are you seeing in your business, and as far as your investing thesis, and are you looking to still be active? And if so, why?
I'm definitely looking to still be active. And my reasoning is, when I started investing, interest rates, or when I first bought my house, the federal funds rate was 3%, right? Federal funds rate within our working career life was, I think, close to 5%. I just looked at it this morning. They were still buying commercial real estate back then. And I think back to when I first bought my house, my old house, that's when the federal funds rate was at 3%. It was at 2.94 or something like that. And so my interest, to me, my mortgage was 6.25. So not fantastic, but that was average. Like that was your standard rate. And then over the next few years, the rate would drop, but the value of my house went up. So we are in an increasing rate environment, and I don't think they're going to continue to raise it. They'll probably do 1 or 2 more hikes from what I'm reading. But as the rates are higher, the rates will go down over the next few years, which will make prices go higher again. And I like that idea because I've done it before and it was fun. Because this is not a get rich quick, right? This is generational. This is I've been doing real estate for a little while. So I've been doing it a while. I still haven't had a get rich quick opportunity. It is a marathon, and in that marathon, you go through some ups and downs. You have some bumps, but when you get in on a higher interest rate and you sell on a lower interest rate, that's kind of my thesis.
You brought up a lot of great points there, Jeff, but I really want to expand on your last point here. Is the time investment in real estate is critical. And, if you look at this bullish cycle that, we've been in since, call it 2011, 2012, especially in commercial real estate,
Right.
in particular. It's just been a very aggressive bullish cycle. There's been a lot of wealth generated over the last decade in real
Hmm.
estate, and like I said, focusing on commercial real estate. And things took a pause for COVID, but then once we realized that, hey, we've got fiscal policy that'll cover us both from a residence and a landlord perspective. Like, hey, we're going to be able to keep the lights on. What did we see? Demand for the investment vehicle.
Hyperbolic.
Yeah, I mean, it accelerated. And I don't think anybody would have ever guessed that it would accelerated in the way it did. And so, but the reason why I bring this up is because what we've seen with that is expectations have like wildly adjusted to expect that delivering 2x 3x multiples in 24 months is now the norm. Oh, I can get a 20% IRR in 2 years. Yes, that's a good deal, and anything below that no longer is a good deal. And this, in my opinion, is living in fantasy land. Like, people have been living in fantasy land for so long that they forgot what reality is, and so to your point, I think this is a very, very necessary reset of expectations, because
Hmm.
it is still a phenomenal time to buy real estate right now. If you understand that the fundamentals are still very, very positive for us as investors, but expectations need to get back to reality. And you just said this perfectly. You don't get rich overnight in real estate. You may get a lucky cash out on a short-term investment, and you may have a great liquidity event, but that's not generating wealth. That's not really cash preservation. So you have to be invested in real estate over the long term if you're really going to be able to benefit from really multiplying your wealth. And so I really appreciate you highlighting that, because I think for listeners, again, you've heard me say this, but we need to get back to realistic expectations. Real estate is a long-term game. It's a 5 to 7 year hold type game. And I think people are going to be forced to realize that the hard way moving
Yeah.
forward. So
There's other benefits as well. Talking about wealth includes tax benefits, right? That's that's a part of wealth, and so understanding that is a key factor. And so having, for you and I as the goal, as sponsorship, those tax advantages is a key driver for me as well.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think, in our opinion, Jeff, and I'm probably sure you would relate to this as well, as investors right now are concerned, right? They're concerned with the volatility in the markets. They're concerned with, again, this monetary policy and how it impacts the overall economic outlook. And so the concern is like, hey, I've got this cash. Where do I put it? And how do I hold on to it? Right.
Hmm.
What is the right vertical I can put this in that I know it's going to preserve? And to your point, I mean, real estate is just such a great vehicle right now, because it's a perfect hedge against inflation. We've heard that time and time again. I mean, it's a perfect cash preservation tool, and it's a great way to be able to benefit, like you said, from the tax code that works in our favor by owning investment real estate. You can create your wealth, but you can also keep most of it by having your real estate holdings. So great points, man. Excellent job there. So tell us, Jeff, what are you looking for then, in the Q3, Q4 this year, as far as your real estate holdings? Tell us a little bit more about your investing thesis, and, what's going to be on the horizon for you.
Yeah, I'm looking for good, strong sponsorships to place my investors in, and myself. We're placing capital, I'm raising capital. And so I look for those strong sponsors. You and I have talked quite a bit. We just did a deal with Lone Star with 300 units here in Houston. I'm partial to Houston because I can be right there with the asset, B plus, B minus, into the A minus, because that's going through the recession. That's the most recession resilient class of property. That's about the lowest class that we're going to go. We're going to stay in those 1980s and above and newer properties.
Love it, man. Love it.
Yeah.
Well, Jeff, man, this has been a great conversation, but I really appreciate your time here. Again, I'm sorry it's taken us 6 to 8 weeks to
No,
get this
man.
rescheduled, but better late than never, like we said. And again, I think this is a very relevant topic for the
Hmm.
listeners to really digest and understand because it's having a major impact on the macroeconomic scale here. But before we wrap up here, Jeff, got a few more questions for you, and then we'll
Of
call it a
course.
day. All right, man. So tell the listeners, what do you like to do for your continued education to further your investing?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm a voracious reader. I'm a voracious audible listener. I'm on the road a lot visiting clients. And so since I have discovered Audible, I am, I'm probably going through about 3 to 4 books a month. Uh, and I love that. And Audible, you can get the podcast as well. So, I'm on your podcast, Hunter Thompson's podcast, and a couple of other old capital. So there's no supply shortage of good content and books.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think I heard you say though, the prosperity through multifamily real estate investing was your favorite. I thought I
That was
heard you
my
say that.
that was my favorite. Yeah.
That's what I thought you heard. I'm pretty sure that came through, but Jeff, looking back on your history and your trajectory, what was that one defining moment of time or event in your investing career that changed, your forward trajectory?
I wouldn't say that there's one that I remember. I've had several. Right. It's every win and every loss almost is. I tell people all the time I've had some dings in my real estate investing career, and it's the wins outweigh the losses. It's you always come out on top, it seems. But kind of my deciding factor was all the way back to that financial crash, right? We owned our house, we did everything right, 20% down, and all of a sudden they're coming out and it's a big crisis, and it's a recession, a big one. And the equity in our house we were upside down. So I basically lost this $25,000 down payment. Uh, and my neighborhood was converting. All these investors were coming in and buying it. And I made a decision right there that I was not going to be there again. I was going to learn how everybody else was buying these houses, and my neighbors were moving out and they were selling it for, 50% of what the house was worth. I was not in a position to do that. And I made a decision right then that the next time this happens, a recession, I'm going to be the guy buying all the houses. Um, so I hate to say it like this, but I am super stoked. We're coming in a kind of position to take advantage, right? Um, to uh, position myself to take advantage of a potential recession. I don't think it's the same as 08, 09 at all. I don't see the deep discounts coming this time around. But I'm in a better position, and I've secured the right network of people.
There you go.
So that
Yeah.
was I know that was a long explanation, but that's what happened to me.
No, that's great. And I can relate to that. I know that's kind of how I got my introduction into real estate was the financial crisis and the impact it had and led me into, my story. But anyway, what advice would you give to the listeners to help them grow their businesses?
Who's trying to start it, to get into business?
Just in general, what comes top to mind when you talk about, what advice you think would be impactful for, people getting their businesses going?
Yeah. Well, just know that it's a grind, right? It's the same thing as sales. It is a grind. And so just stay focused on revenue generating activities, and which should be what you're good at, right? So for me, I'm very strong at cold calling and being in front of the client. So anything outside of that, I consider non-revenue generating activities. We can get caught up in the weeds. We can get caught up in answering emails. You get caught up in some other activity that is not a value add. So understand your strong suit and stick with that.
Great advice, man.
Focus on it.
Excellent advice, Jeff. Really appreciate that. So, all right, man. We'll tell the listeners how they can learn more about you and get connected with you.
Yeah, I have a report that it shows all the reasons we like multifamily. You can download it at multifamilyadvice.com. That's multifamilyadvice.com. Download that report, and it'll put you into my email funnel and schedule a call, man. Let's talk. I've done a lot of different types of real estate. Maybe you're trying to get into it. Let's just ask me a question, man. I don't charge any money. Let's talk about what you're trying to get into, and I can tell you the good, bad, and ugly.
Well, Jeff, man, it's been an honor having you here on the show. Really enjoyed the conversation, man. I enjoyed the friendship here over the last several years, and really looking forward to your success coming, and definitely looking forward to connecting offline here. So thanks for tuning in with us, and we'll catch you next time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
Thank you.